Good afternoon, and welcome to the Yale Center for British Arts program at Home Artists in Conversation. I'm Linda Friedlaender, Head of Education, and our special guest today is Susan Philipsz. Please note that this program will be recorded. Your camera and sound are muted and will remain so throughout the program. We will be using the Q&A feature on your navigation bar to gather your questions, and we will attempt to answer them at the end of the program, but please feel free to submit questions anytime. If you would like closed captioning, a live transcript is available by clicking on the icon on your toolbar. Yale University acknowledges that the indigenous peoples and nations have stewarded through generations the land and waterways of what is now the state of Connecticut. We honor and we respect the enduring relationship that exists between these people and nations and this land. The Scottish artist Susan Philipsz has worked with sound for years, even though her training is in sculpture. Even as an art student, the two fields have always been attached. When studying sculpture at the Duncan of Jordanstone College of Art and Design, University of Dundee, she thought about the physicality of producing sound and how it could define space. Her graduate studies in Belfast were where she developed interest in both the architectural and emotive and psychological effects of sound and song. The presentation of a sound piece, says Anna Gebers, a curator at the Hamburger Bahnhof in Berlin, involved what she termed the acoustic creation of space. Sound artist and historian Seth Kim Cohen explains that even in its beginnings, sound was aligned with developments in avant-garde music. American composer and artist John Cage composed his first silent composition in 1948. However, it took the artistic community until 2010 to recognize fully the extent of this genre by awarding Susan the Turner Prize, the first time in its history to award an artist who did not create anything visible or tangible. Instead, her prize-winning work was comprised of the sound of her voice singing three slightly different versions of a Scottish lament installed under three bridges in Glasgow. And the New York Museum of Modern Art had its first major exhibition of sonic art in 2013, featuring Susan and others to address how sound can shape a physical space. Susan was awarded an OBE in 2014, Officer of the Order of the British Empire for outstanding achievement to art. Her work can be found in so many collections, both in the States and internationally, such as the collections of the Baltimore Museum, the Byler Foundation in Basel, the Carnegie Museum of Art, the Rivoli in Italy, the Guggenheim and the Hirshhorn Museum in Washington, D.C., the National Centro de Arte Reina Sofia in Madrid, Museum of Contemporary Art in Chicago, Museum Ludwig in Cologne, San Francisco Museum of Modern Art, the Tate, and the Walker Art Center in Minneapolis. And I think it would be important to note that Susan is represented by the Tanya Bonakadar Gallery in New York City. I just had the pleasure of meeting Susan a couple of days ago, and I understood from her that she has actually been to New Haven and visited the city, and of course the university, and the Beinecke Library. And she's going to tell us a little bit about that experience for her beginning. Susan.
Oh, thank you, Linda. It's really nice to be here. Yeah, I would love to start with this work, The Dead, that I made in 2000 actually. So it was a long time ago that I made this work, and it was inspired by James Joyce's story, The Dead, from the Dubliners. And it's basically a sound installation on 35mm film that I made for the Irish Museum of Modern Art. And yeah, I mean, I couldn't believe that the original manuscript was there in the Beinecke Library. And when I asked if I could see it, they said, sure. And they handed it to me. And I was so overwhelmed, tears came to my eyes. And I thought, oh no, I don't want to spoil this original manuscript with my tears. So I managed to prevent splodges of tears on the front, but I couldn't believe this, it was handwritten like this. So just to say a bit about the work. So The Dead was, I mean, I've been inspired a lot by James Joyce, not just with this one, but many works over the years. And the story of The Dead is about a couple who go to a party on the Feast of the Epiphany. And it's only when they're leaving that the heroine, Greta, overhears someone sing a song that catapults her back to a time where she knew Michael Fury, a boy that they were sweethearts when they were young, and he used to sing the song, The Lass of Aughrim, that she hears. And she's enraptured by this song. And tragically, Michael Fury, in a sense, dies for her love. And so this story is this is revealed later on in the story. But up until that point, they're having a great time. And it's only when she hears this song that her mood changes, she becomes melancholy. And Gabriel, the husband, realizes that he could never love the way she loved then. So he has this epiphany. So what I've done, so the song, The Lass of Aughrim, that she hears is from a tradition of broken token songs. And a broken token is when people used to exchange tokens. They would maybe have a handkerchief or a ring. And so in 7 years after being at war, they could come back and say, yes, I am William. Yeah, I might have changed, but it's me. Look, I have the token. Or if they had slept together and maybe she falls pregnant, she can prove, which is in the case of the Lass of Aughrim. But sadly, he doesn't believe her. Oh, don't you remember that night on Yonley Hill? So what I've done is I've recorded myself sing the song, The Lass of Aughrim, in real time and have it transposed onto 35mm film stock, which is the film stock. It's the 35 was the film that I would say John Huston used when he did his wonderful adaptation of The Dead. I suppose it was also very inspired by the adaptation, John Huston's adaptation of The Dead. So I'm singing the song over and over again in real time, and I'm trying to evoke this sense of solitude and time passing. And I'm clearly not a trained singer. So I'm singing, it starts, oh, if you be the lass of Aughrim, as I take it you mean to be, tell me the first token that passed between you and me. Then it switches to the first person, oh, don't you remember that night on Yonley Hill? So the word, it's a very sad song. So what the installation is basically the sound transposed onto black film stock, and over time the film stock begins to deteriorate. There's little blemishes and scratches appear on the surface of the film, which in the business is known as snow. And I thought that was interesting because at the last scene of the film, where after Greta falls asleep, Gabrielle is gazing out of the window and it's snowing outside and it's dark. And the camera pans up into the night sky, and Tony Huston, so it's Greta is played by Angelica Huston, John Huston's daughter, and the screenplay is written by her brother, Tony Huston, and And so the last part of the screenplay is written, camera pans up to the night sky until flakes of snow fall directly into the lens, fade out, the end. So I suppose my work, The Dead, is an extension of that last scene. And Joyce, I mean, he was obsessed with cinema. He would he would go with his family every week to watch the cinema when he lived in, watch movies in Italy. And he said, I read this where he said, whenever I'm obliged to lie with my eyes closed, I see a cinematograph going on, and it brings back to my mind things that I'd almost forgotten. So when he talks about the cinematograph, he means the projector. So he even opened his own cinema in Ireland for a while, called the Volta. He was so passionate about cinema. So I'm going to show the film as it was installed in the Wexner cinema. Oh yeah, so this is the film stock with my voice on it. So it's been transposed. You can see the sound track on the right-hand side, and you can see that the film stock is black. And this is how it was.
Oh, if you be the last of Ogham, as I'm taking you mean to be, tell me the first token that passed between you and me. Oh, don't you remember that night on Yonley Hill, when we both met together, which I'm sorry now to tell. Oh, the rain falls on my heavy locks, and the dew wets my skin. My babe lies cold within my arms, but none will let me in. My babe lies cold within my arms, but none will let me in.
Thank you for that, Susan.
Oh, thank you.
Quite special.
Thanks. Yeah, well, I'm clearly not a trained singer, and I deliberately kept the voice dry. I didn't want to make it sound, I wanted it to sound like a normal voice and more intimate. So, but yeah, I do cringe every time I hear it because it's such bad singing, but I'm glad you like it. Yeah, and the way the screen flickers, you can see, I mean, it's dark, but you can still see some movement, the flickering light, and it sort of suggests the one of the lines in the Dead, whenever not being able to apprehend the wayward and flickering existence of the vast hosts of the dead. Finally, the snow covers the landscape. So it's sort of suggestive of that line at the end of the Dead.
Okay. Would you like to go to the next
Yes.
slide, please?
So this
Okay.
is Lowlands.
Go ahead.
Yeah. So now we're in Glasgow. This is a work, Lowlands, I made in 2010. Well, for these bridges. Well, in fact, it wasn't originally for the bridges, but it was such a perfect fit. It was like it was made for these three bridges that cross the Clyde. Because when I think of the Lowlands, I think of the Lowlands of Glasgow. You know, we're in the Lowlands, but in this, again, I'm working with a song. This song is from the 16th century. It's an old Scottish lament that became a sea shanty, and it sings of the Lowlands, but it's the Lowlands of the Netherlands, and it's the windy Lowlands, and to be drowned in the windy Lowlands. And I always found this lyric very fascinating because, you know, for me, it's the hills, you know, it's the Lowlands of the hills in Scotland, you know, not how can you be drowned in the windy Lowlands. And so this song sort of evolved, you know, it was a song that like I say, the sailors adopted, and it changed from port to port. And so there's different versions of it, and it's about someone who is drowned and comes back to say a final farewell to their loved one, and they appear in weeds, covered in weeds so cold. And in one version, it's a woman who's drowned, and another, it's a man who's drowned. Her sailor husband is drowned, and she wants to cut away her bonny hair. She wants to tear her breasts until they bleed. And you wonder how the sailors managed to adapt it to a sea shanty, but they did, when you think of the lyrics. But it's a very sad song, but there's lots of, so I chose to sing the three versions of it, and they're different lengths. Some versions one version is quite short, and the longest version is about 7 minutes long. And I placed them under the three bridges that cross the River Clyde in Glasgow, and this is one of them. And these bridges see so much of the vernacular of the city of Glasgow. It's right in the heart of the city. It's the first thing that you see when you go to Glasgow. And so I installed speakers under each of the bridges with the three versions of the song, and they played simultaneously, but there were different lyrics. So but they come together in the main refrain, Lowlands, Lowlands away, because there are three different versions of the song. So this sort of, the effect is the sound seems to intermingle and come together and apart again. And I'm utilizing the underside of the acoustics of the bridge. And these bridges, no one, especially this one, people don't really go there. It looks quite beautiful, but it's kind of like the underbelly of Glasgow, you know, under bridges, what happens under bridges, you know, you find homeless people that are, you know, sort of the dark side, the underbelly of the city. So, but when you're actually standing there, it's quite beautiful, you know. So, and so I can play the film. I have a very short clip of the film as it was installed in Glasgow, and then I can say a little bit more about it. Yeah.
Susan, when you begin a project like this, do you find the site first? Do you think of the sound first and then, you know, which comes first?
Well, usually the place comes first. I have to go and find the place to get the inspiration. But in this case, it was a bit different because I was so familiar with these bridges. I'm from Glasgow. And I had made a work with this, this ballad, these three versions of this Lowlands ballad for a gallery in Berlin. And it was actually, when I was invited by the Glasgow International, I immediately thought that it would be the perfect home for that work, Lowlands. And because it just connected so well to these three bridges, and you know that it sings of the Lowlands, and Glasgow is the Lowlands, and it's also and these bridges are they're quite sad. You often see flowers there from people committing suicide there. There's a lot of drownings and dark stories to be told. And just being there for a few days installing, people bring their own stories to it, and they have their own interpretations, which was really fascinating for me, and to get to know some of the people that actually lived in the bridge, you know. But yeah, so I'm sorry, I'm going off on a tangent here. Yeah, but usually I have to go to the place to know it, and then it starts from there. Yeah.
Okay. Let's go on to another.
Yeah, okay. So this is a work called Part File Score that I made for the Hamburger Bahnhof Museum in Berlin. And I was asked to respond to the historical hall of the museum, which is massive. And it's a very daunting space. I mean, you can see it on the right-hand side. It has these very impressive 12 steel archways. It had formerly been a train station, and when everything's taken away, all the walls, and you really see that it was, and you can hear it in the acoustics of the space. So it's not the easiest space to work with for a lot of people, but I loved it, and I was inspired by not only the acoustics and the scale of the space, but these 12 archways, and I started thinking about working or deconstructing a 12-tone composition. And I became fascinated by Hans Eisler. He was a 12-tone composer who was a prodigy of Arnold Schoenberg. And he had to flee Nazi Germany in the 30s, like many people did, and fled to Hollywood. A lot of these composers and writers like Thomas Mann and they went to Hollywood. And Hans Eisler embraced his new life there. Him and Bertolt Brecht, his best friend, who didn't like it so much, but Hans Eisler loved it. And so it was an explosion of all this new talent in Hollywood, these composers, but really sadly, no, he was persecuted while he was in the US because the FBI believed he was a communist who was there to infiltrate the Hollywood dream factory, and so they were following his every move. And so for over a period of 6 years, they compiled a huge file on Eisler, 676 pages long. And you can see from the file, which was later declassified, heavily redacted, but declassified, you see the people that he knew, you know, like Adorno, like Bertolt Brecht and Chaplin, Charlie Chaplin. And so Charlie Chaplin, he knew that Eisler was being hounded by the FBI, and he wanted to help Hans Eisler by commissioning him to do a score for his film The Circus. And so Eisler wrote the septet, but it was never completed because he was brought in front of the House of Un-American Activities, Hans Eisler. He was the very first person, artist to be, and he had to leave the country. He was heartbroken. And as you know, then Chaplin followed in his footsteps, but Eisler was one of the first to be persecuted by the House of Un-American Activities. Here's a clip of the film. What you just saw and heard there was a 24-channel sound installation that was inspired by the historical hall's 12 steel archways. And what I did was record 3 film scores that Eisler made while he was in the US, and recorded all of the tones separately. I deconstructed the 12-tone composition. And so every speaker is like a tone on the chromatic scale. So A only came from this speaker, C from another, and so on. And so you get this sense of the displacement and fragmentation and the separation of so that was also, I mean, it's in his biography, it's in what happened to him, you know, like he was displaced and he was and separated and moving, you know, he had to move, you know, so this is also in the sort of physical making of the work, where each of the tones are separated and displaced throughout the space, and there's a movement throughout the space, so the sound is continually moving. And when you're up close to one speaker, you can really hear the physicality of the musician as he draws his bow across the strings of the violin or the piano. Because sometimes I used two instruments, which was why there was 24 speakers. Yeah, so that's basically what you heard in the space. And then what you saw was the images of where I took the FBI redacted files on Eisler and selected some from the 676 pages of them, and superimposed that onto the film score that he wrote. So you see, the heavily redactions by the FBI, but also some redactions of an Eisler's own hand where he writes on the margins and things. So I made these large scale screen prints, 12 of them between each of the archways.
And I know you're very intentional about which instruments you select for which spaces. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, well, I chose instruments like two voices from the entire composition, but what you just heard was actually just the violin. And other scores, there were more than one, but in the septet for Chaplin's The Circus, it's the violin is the main instrument, and I chose that, and so all the other instrumentation is gone. You only hear that voice, that the violin. So I chose that because that is in the score.
Okay.
It's the primary instrument in the score. Yeah.
Okay.
So shall I move on to the next slide?
Sure.
I think this is the Tate. Yeah. So this work is called War Damaged Musical Instruments, and I made it for Tate Britain's Devine Galleries. And this is a 14-channel sound installation. And I really want to, again, work with the scale of the space and its acoustics. So this is an ongoing series of recordings of musical instruments that were damaged in war, different wars. So from the Battle of Waterloo to I recorded the Balaclava bugle from the charge of the Light Brigade, and some of these instruments from museums both in the UK and Germany had such interesting stories to tell about the people who like, for instance, Billy Britton. He led the charge, little Billy Britton, and but the cost, it was the Crimean War, and the Cossack, he fell and he had his bugle around his wrist, with the rope, and the Cossack tried to take the bugle from his hand, but he only managed to lance the bugle. So, and Billy Britton's taken to hospital, and he is nursed by Florence Nightingale, but sadly he dies. Yeah, but his story lives on. It's such an incredible story. And then there's other stories like the little drummer boy on the battlefield of Battle of Waterloo, and he had his little notebook with the music in his pocket, and he was only 14. So, but then there are other you don't know what happened to them, like one horn has a bullet hole right through it, but you don't know who the last person to have played that was. But mostly they were military bugles, because these bugles were used on the battlefield. They were signal horns to indicate certain things, advance, retreat. And so what I did was choose one of these signals, one that's the most famous one, which is known as the last post, and it's to indicate it's okay to come back in. It's safe to come back. You know, if you're wounded, now's the time to come back in. But then it became also the signal for end of the day, and or taps off. It's also it's also known as the taps, like meaning the end of the pubs are closed, the beer tap is closed, so it's called the tap. It's the end of the day. So, but there's only 4 tones that make up the last post, and but it's a very known tune. But when you just again play each of the tones individually, each of the 4 tones, and separate all the tones, it becomes very abstract. And at times when you do know that it is the last post, sometimes it comes together and you do hear sections, fragments of it. But it's basically fragmented, and it comes from these horn speakers that you see hanging in the space. So you have the balaclava bugle call to the horn from the Battle of Waterloo. But it was nice for this. I did a 2-version one, and I did a 8-version one, and finally I could show all 14 recordings, and I was able to also show to record instruments that weren't only military horns, but also instruments that were damaged in the Alp bunker here in Berlin, and that was from the Second World War. So there was also a clarinet and a saxophone and different. So that added another layer of this. That wasn't military. There were people. But anyway, I'll play the film.
Okay.
Oh no! Sorry. I wanted to show you this as well. This tells you exactly which each speaker is, which horn each speaker represents, so you have up at the top, you have the balaclava bugle, and then the alt saxophone, and then the different stories that go with each of the horns that we recorded. So I've got 2 films. There's one, a very short one of the making of, which was when we finally got to record the damaged instruments that were from the bunker. And they're from the Musical Instrument Museum here in Berlin. And then there's the work as it was in the Tate. So this is the making of.
Entweder die, der da wahrscheinlich das Mundstück überhaupt. Also bei der könnte das Mundstück da bis hierhin. Ja. Also das gibt wahrscheinlich interessant. Die brauchen erstmal die Nummern eingeben, wo sie einen Kopfhörer, wo sie das Symbol sehen. Die Nummern eingeben und dann geht das Ganze los, ne? Ja.
So I want it to be evocative, more about the breath and not about trying to make this tune, but more about breathing and footing.
Susan,
I-
I know that starting to see a certain pattern here, that there are certain ideas that for you are very important, that have to do with history, that have to do with memory, that have to do with displacement, as you've mentioned, and that in thinking about these instruments, it was important to you because to use horns because you wanted to pay homage to these people that were killed in these battles, in these wars that we do and those that we don't know about. And by reinvigorating these instruments, as battered as they are, with human breath, was, I know for you, a way of somehow bringing them back or paying honor to their memory. Could you just address those feelings of yours?
Yeah, and that's exactly right. I mean, when I first came across these broken instruments in the vitrine in the Musical Instrument Museum here in Berlin, I mean, the immediate thought was, what would happen if you did try to produce sound with these instruments? Could they produce sound? And, you know, and the idea that you could breathe life back into them after being, but I was amazed that, you know, the sound that some of them could produce when some of them were so badly damaged. And I was so happy as well that we could use those instruments that you saw in the film, because they were the first ones that I came across, but they wouldn't let me use them. And so I had to go and find others, and it took me literally years to find them. But yeah, but because they do have these, they are very badly damaged, it does take a lot of breath to produce sound from them. So the breath escapes from the bullet hole or the gash in the, so then the breath is emphasized, and you know, as you said, it is like a metaphor for life and mortality, you know, breath. So that became an important aspect of it. And yeah. And when I worked with when I made the recordings in the UK, when that's where we got the balaclava bugle, and I worked with students, music students from there, and they got quite emotional just thinking about the last people to have played these instruments. I mean, these instruments are in archives that haven't seen the light of day for over 100 years, you know, and they're all dusty and they're kind of, but then you could see they were, you know, becoming quite emotional just thinking about the, you know, the last person to have played it, and they themselves being the age of the soldier, probably they're just students, you know. So it was a very interesting experience and I felt really privileged to get access to these incredible archives with these musical instruments that they don't, because they're broken, you know, they're never exhibited, you know.
Mhm.
Mm.
Let's go to the next, please.
Yeah. Oh yeah, here's the film as it was at the page. Yeah, the horn you just heard at the end, that was the balaclava bugle.
Okay, I want to make sure we get time for everything to get in. Can we?
Yes.
Okay, so tell us where we are now.
So
And
this is a work I did for Documenta in 2013 called Study for Strings. And I was invited by Caroline Christoph Bakargiev to come to Kassel and to basically find a site. So I found Kassel to be a particularly uninspiring city, a very ugly city, to be honest. And but it was only when I came to this train station and walked out to the platform's end that I thought, okay, now I've finally found my location. And the idea that a distant sound would come from the hills, the sound would come from a distance. This was the starting point of the spark for the idea. But I had no idea about the history of Kassel at that time, and then the train station. That all came afterwards. And so these, these themes of distance and separation, which are recurring themes. So this is the feeling I had when I was gazing out into the hills at the platform's end. But then I saw a plaque that was dedicated to the prisoners who had to were deported to 3 different camps, and one of them was Theresienstadt. And I had read about Theresienstadt in Sibolt's Austerlitz, his novel Austerlitz, and in it there's he's trying to find his mother. She was an opera singer, and famously, a lot of the creative people were sent to this particular camp: writers, musicians, artists, and there was a film made, a propaganda film. And he is scouring the film, trying to see if he can see his mother in it. And so I thought, okay. And I'd also read about Pavel Haas in the book, because Pavel Haas was a Czech composer, and he wrote Study for Strings that features prominently in this propaganda film that was made by the SS to impress the Danish Red Cross that were coming. And just show the world that they weren't as bad as what people were saying. And so they put together this film, which was a complete fake, people sitting, watching an orchestra play with having coffee and cafes and all with, Stars of David. I mean, it was just it was all just for the cameras and to impress the Red Cross. And so they did this beautification project of Theresienstadt. And so I read about this in the book. So I thought that could be the starting point for the work. And so what I did was, again, deconstruct the composition this time by Pavel Haas, the composition that he made while he was interned in Theresienstadt, called Study for Strings. And I took 2 of the voices from the entire orchestra. I took the violin and the viola, the cello and the viola, sorry. And so what you hear then are lots of gaps and silences where the other voices, the other instrumentation should be. So the effect is that the sound sounds like it's almost like a broken down train or something, because I think the original version, it does sort of evoke going through the landscape and seeing these images fleetingly through the window, very fast moving. But when you take away all the other instrumentation and you only have these two voices, then you sort of think about the absence of the other voices. So what I did was record the tones, tone for tone, in the same way as I did for Heartfile Score, Hamburger Bahnhof, and have each of the speakers installed out on the train tracks themselves. So all the tones are separated and scattered across the tracks. So you hear the tones from a distance coming towards you from the platform's end. So I can show you a very short. Oh, here is some film stills of the propaganda film. On the left, you have Pavel Haas, and on the right, you have the orchestra play. And here is the view from the platform's end. Yeah. So
Yes, let's go to the next slide, please. Yeah.
okay. So the final work of my presentation is my most recent work, and it's called Study for Strings Sokol Terezín. So since I started teaching in Dresden, I really wanted to visit Terezín. I mean, it's only an hour away by car. It's in the Czech Republic, but it's very close to Dresden. And I wanted to visit the place where this film was shot, where Pavel Haas performed and the orchestra performed for the film. So I went there and no one knew anything about the location, and it took several trips before we actually found it. And it's in this sports society called Sokol. And honestly, when I walked into the building, I got goosebumps. I mean, it's such an atmospheric place. And they gave us a tour of the building, and we went right down into the basement, and I can imagine a sound installation in the space. And then I thought, well, maybe I could revisit Study for Strings. And so what I did was create a 24 channel sound installation in the entire building, and we had a film crew, and we went in and we installed the speakers all over the building, working with the acoustics of the building. And basically I asked the film crew to follow the sound, where most of the speakers were in the basement. So the sound was from a distance, and they worked their way down into the basement. But the space where the actual orchestra played Study for Strings, I mean, that was really goosebumps, you know, just walking into that space. I mean, it's a gymnasium. It's a gymnasium, and the space that they had originally for the performance was too small, so they just made it look like it was a concert hall for the film. But it was just that realization that we were in, that we found it. It was quite incredible. So it's a very evocative place. And so what I did was record both the as I mentioned before, the viola and the cello parts. And so one screen is with just the viola and the other is the cello. And they're both coming different routes through the building. The camera moves through the building with a steady cam, but they both kind of gradually end up down in the darkness of the cellar. So it descends from the light to the dark. So I can show you a little bit of how it is.
tough stuff.
Yeah, yeah. So I think that was the end of the presentation. So I'll
Yes, I have some questions.
yeah.
First, what do you consider the art part of what you create? Considering the installation part, the music part, is it the visitors that walk through and experience it? We talked about how when you got the Turner Prize, that it was the first time a prize was given to an artist that had nothing you could touch or you could hold. So what is the art part? And then I have some others. So I know these are big questions, but I'd like to get to as many as we can.
Yeah, well, it depends on the work. I mean, the art is the experience of, you know, in Documenta, it was to be out on the platform's end and hearing the sound all around you, and combined with the sound of nature and the trains, and all that became a really essential part of the experience. And people, you know, and it was very interesting to then experience it back in a gallery setting, because for me it was, I mean, it was created in the studio. So, and I got all the intimacy back, and you could hear Dimitri's breath, and you could hear the bow across the strings, and you could hear the separation of the tones more clearly. So we got some of that back, which I really liked. But then, of course, when it's in the situation like a train station, that all becomes part of the work. But the work is essentially the recordings, you know, and it can take on a new life in a different context, as it was proved with Lowlands before, because that was originally for a gallery, but really found its home under the 3 bridges that cross the Clyde. So I find this really fascinating, actually, that how the context can really shift your interpretation of the meaning of the work, or you can, you know, it's yeah. So but the work is the actual recordings that I make here, and then yeah.
Okay.
But it can be flexible where you install it. You know, I don't think it only ever has to be in one fixed location, but it has to be the right location, you know.
Right. Speaking of that, how do you find your locations for your site-specific work? What do you look for? Where do you begin?
Well, I begin by, you know, it's often quite intuitive. You know, you go in and you sort of, maybe I'll project my voice out into the room, the space, if it has interest in acoustics. So, you know, and I see, you know, what the reverberation time is like, and also the atmosphere of the place. And then if it's, and then it might have some interesting, the history, like, of course, like in Castle. I mean, Castle, I forgot to mention, was the reason why it's such an ugly city. It was bombed so heavily in the war because of the ammunitions factory that was just beyond. If you could follow the tracks around, that's where you would come to. And so I was finding all this stuff out about Castle and the train station that I couldn't believe, you know, and I thought, it's almost too much. I can't really go there. You know, you just scratch the surface and all of this history is revealed. It was kind of really dark as well, you know, and so shocking. I mean, so yeah, so I you know, I do some if I think, okay, this space seems interesting, I do some research, and then I find out other things about it that, you know, like in Munster Sculpture Project, this bridge that crossed the lake, you know, it was like you were looking into a mirror because people are staring back at you, and then that inspired the Lost Reflection, you know, so things just sort of happen, you know, like the architecture, the acoustics, the history, and like a song might come to my head, a song as it did in Munster, this Barcarolle, and these words, far away, this duet, you know, and I was just, again, it's like this distance and separation, these themes that were coming to me as I was standing there. So yeah, but then I was amazed to find that this barcarolle was actually written by, it was by Offenbach, a German composer, but it was about tales of Hoffmann, you know. So, but I had no idea when I was remembering this song as a child, you know. So yeah, so it's a lot of different things. Yeah.
When and how did you start thinking of your own voice as sculptural material?
Yeah, well, I suppose that happened when I was still a student, and I gradually started introducing sound into my sculptural installations, and I became aware of the physicality of producing sound and what happens when you project your voice out into a room, and I became very aware of my own breath and my inner body space, you know. And you know, you need to take, especially when you sing, you know, you have to really use your diaphragm and project your voice out into the space, and then it defines the space that you're in. So I started thinking about it in sort of sculptural terms, and I became very interested, as you said earlier, the architectural concerns of sound and how it can define space. And so, and then that became something that I wanted to explore space outside with, and you know, that was really an ideal medium to explore scale and within my means. I mean, it's not, you know, to work with sound when I was younger. I mean, it was really and you cover huge distances with sound, but with very little means. So that was a wonderful. So those two things kind of came hand in hand, working with sound and working in public space.
We'll take one more. What is the connection of voice to the other musical instruments that you use, such as strings and brass instruments?
Well, there's not really a connection to voice. I mean, I treat my voice like I would with the instruments. You know, the physicality of producing the sound, it's important to hear that in the recording, as it is important to understand that I don't have a trained voice, and I don't try and make it sound. I want to have the human presence there in the recordings. And that's the case when I work with the violinist or the cello, so that, you know, you do hear the creak of the bow, you do occasionally hear the breath, and the flaws, you know, that there are people there producing these sounds. And you know, with my voice, it's, you know, it's, everyone can identify with the human voice, everyone has one, and so I really want it to sound more I mean, it's when it's sung in a particular way, it's more like singing to yourself than to an audience. Creates a certain vulnerability, I guess, about it. And that's the same thing that happens when you separate the tones. You really hear the instrument. You know, it's not by having just the individual tones. It becomes about the instrument and the physicality of producing those tones.
Thank you, Susan. I'd like everyone to please take note in the chat. Susan will be having an exhibition on Study for Strings Sokol Terezín, the last two slides that she had talked about. And we have the website for you to check out where it is. And I hope if you're traveling throughout Europe during the summer, that you might have an opportunity to see it. And remember that she is represented by, for those of us from the States, by the Bagardar Gallery in New York City, and to keep an eye out for when she has exhibitions there. Thank you so much, Susan, for enlightening us and for sharing time with us to describe who you are and how that informs on such a high level the kind of work that you make. Thank you.
Thank you, Linda. It's my pleasure.
Okay, and thank you for those of you who visited us today.